Last year, the federal government announced $1.7 billion to clean up orphaned oil and gas wells, mostly in Western Canada and mostly in Alberta, where they got $1 billion for it. Well, things didn't work out quite as they were intended to, apparently. And so I'm going to talk to Megan Egler, who is a natural resources PhD student and researcher with Parkland Institute of the University of Alberta. So welcome to the interview, Megan.
Thanks a lot. This report was written about 7 or 8 months after the rollout of the site rehabilitation program, which was the Alberta government's rollout of this $1 billion of federal funding. And essentially what the findings were was that this public funding was simply just not well spent. So this is a bipartisan issue. It doesn't matter what side of the political spectrum you're on. This money simply could have been spent better. So what it did amount to was a bailout to some of the biggest oil and gas producers in the country, rather than an adequate support for Albertan workers and businesses, which it intended to be. The majority of funds essentially went towards relieving the environmental liabilities of big corporations who were well positioned to pay up and legally were obligated to. And it could have been better directed towards companies that were truly suffering in the province, as well as the workers who were at the time often unemployed.
Now, my take on this, Megan, is because we've followed this story for quite a while, is that there is a big inventory of orphan wells, or orphan and inactive wells, 168,000. There are then several thousand, I forget the exact number, with the Orphan Well Association, which levies a fee to clean those up on behalf of industry and government. And this $1 billion was meant to clean up wells over and above that, over and above what industry was doing, over and above what the Orphan Well Association was doing, to create new jobs or put people back to work and make inroads into that inventory that's been hanging over the industry and the government for a long time. Is that fair to say that that was the intent of the program?
Yeah, I believe certainly at the federal level, that was the intent of the program. I mean, the funding was meant for both inactive wells and orphan wells. So orphan wells being the wells that don't have anyone who's legally responsible for them other than the state. What we did see, however, is that the full $1 billion that was allocated to Alberta went only to inactive wells. So it didn't touch on the orphan well inventory whatsoever. And also we saw that a high percentage of the funds ended up going to some of the biggest oil and gas producers in the country who, like, for example, CNRL posted, I don't know the numbers off the top of my head, but like dividend increases this past March. So they weren't necessarily in need or at risk of going bankrupt, as were some companies in Alberta that could have used the funds more.
Yeah, we see that all 4 or 5 of the bigger oil sands companies have a big focus on free cash flow and giving it back to shareholders in the form of dividends and share buybacks, which is great for the investors. The problem is, of course, that if CNRL got $100 million from the government, it just could reduce its, presumably anyway, this is what happened, reduce the expenditure on inactive well remediation by $100 million, and the payback, the share dividends and share buybacks don't change, which investors love, and then that makes them happy with management. That it sounds like that was the case.
Yeah, at least it looked like it was the case. The something that plagued this report from the beginning was a huge lack of transparency in public data from the government of Alberta around the oil and gas industry. So I guess I want to make very clear that this report, because of the lack of data, has quite a few holes in it, but what data there is was so suggestive that the program wasn't meeting goals, and I couldn't actually find any government data that was saying that it was meeting the goals. So I think that we just need to shine a brighter light on these kind of programs, especially when it's such a large amount of public funding.
Well, that doesn't surprise me. I think you are not the first expert source that I've interviewed about this and related issues around the Alberta government, the Alberta Energy Regulator, the Orphan Well Association, who say there isn't enough data, and what there is, it's not transparent. and even I remember Nina Lothian from the Parkland Institute, I was interviewing her about oil sands, and she said that not even the government has enough data. Like the industry has the data, they don't share it with government, and which is supposed to be looking after regulating it and setting policy. So it seems like this is a small subset of a bigger, much bigger problem in Alberta around regulation in the industry.
Yeah, I would agree with that for sure.
So, there are there are some other issues. Now, to many Albertans, they may think of this as minor issues, but Indigenous participation was not meant to be, was not what it was promised to be. There's supposed to be a gender balance in jobs creation. That wasn't there. How did you? What can you tell us about that?
Yeah, sure. So in the design of this program, there were several mechanisms to increase the participation of Indigenous community members and businesses. So these also being slightly hard to assess due to a lack of public information, but what data I could find did not suggest that these measures were at all increasing Indigenous participation in a meaningful way. Also, there's opportunities for both landowners and Indigenous community members to nominate sites for abandonment and reclamation. So often these are sites that are within people's communities or on people's land that have been ignored and not cleaned up. So they were given the opportunity to nominate them. And I heard a lot of really positive reflection on this mechanism within the program. However, when I took abandonment data that was available and cross-referenced it with the nominations, those wells weren't actually being abandoned or reclaimed. This, I guess, is kind of unsurprising because there was no prioritization of those wells within the program in those first 6 periods, which represent $800 million. So,
well, let's talk about narrative for a minute, because you and I had a chat before the interview about this, and the narrative around this program was really positive. It came at a time when oil and gas jobs were plummeted by, I think it was 30 or 40,000, and people were, rural Alberta was really hard hit. So this was seen as a way to put money back in the pockets and at the same time clean up a problem that's been bedeviling the industry and the government for many, many years. And it just, reality, once again, reality didn't jibe with the narrative.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, I certainly bought into the narrative of this program as I was seeing it rolled out. And I love seeing programs that are able to balance both positive environmental outcomes and job creation, because those are 2 things that we really need to thrive as communities and thrive as Albertans. I think that this program represented a huge missed opportunity to support Albertans, especially when they really needed it in the midst of a pandemic, while cleaning up the mess left by oil and gas companies in a way that could have both built trust and was socially and environmentally just. Unfortunately, that did seem to all be window dressing. I mean, a lot was said about this program that was really hopeful, but I could not find proof that any of these things were working or being achieved. And I would love to see the data on it. I know that there's already been some commentary coming from the Alberta government saying that there's inaccuracies or maybe some things about the report didn't line up, but I think that is a challenge then for the industry and for the Alberta government to make that data open and let us assess these programs, because there's likely to be more of them. And I think we need to be watching them,
Well, isn't that interesting? There are holes in your report, which you acknowledge because there isn't enough data, and the government that doesn't provide the data then criticizes the holes. I mean, circular argument. But anyway, thank you very much for this, Megan. Really interesting. And we'll follow up on this, because your point is that there will be likely more programs like this. And if this one failed, if somebody doesn't, if the lessons aren't learned, then it doesn't bode well for future programs. So thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks for having me.